All right, let us begin with part 4 of chapter 14. Chapter 14, of course, the Jarrett chapter dealing with the 1960s. All right, we're going to begin with another Supreme Court case. We ended our last video with 2 or 3 of them. This one is going to be looking at school funding. So I'm waiting for my drawing mode to kick in. There we go. Edgewood versus Kirby. Edgewood Independent School District, 1984. Edgewood versus Kirby. The Edgewood School District sued the state of Texas, saying that the way school districts were funded primarily by local monies, taxes on property within the local district. So Edgewood basically said that the way districts were funded was unfair to smaller, poorer districts. It shouldn't be less poorer, it should be poorer. Sorry about that. That word less really shouldn't be there. But anyway, poor districts, and so the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Edgewood, saying that, yeah, basically, it is not right, it is not correct, it is, in the Supreme Court's opinion, unconstitutional, and that the state had to find a more fair and efficient way to fund public schools. And this is just a year or two after I started working, and so some people refer to the method that was eventually arrived as the Robin Hood plan, where more well-off, wealthier districts would contribute some of their money that they raised through property taxes to less economically advantaged. So rich districts would give money to poor districts, essentially. That's what the whole idea behind Edgewood versus Kirby was. The state of Texas had to find a more fair and efficient way to fund public schools. Essentially, what became known as the Robin Hood plan took effect. Right. Baby boomers, we've talked about this previously. Anyone born in the United States between 1945 and 1963, which of course includes me, were referred to as the baby boom generation. This is the first generation post-World War II. A large number of them reached adulthood in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, again, depending on how you define adulthood. I graduated from high school in 1977. I was 18 years of age. But if you were born in 1945, by 1965, you were 20 years old. So again, yes, in the late 60s, early 70s, we start to see the first of the baby boomers become 20, 21, 22, whatever the case may be. So again, the bulk of them, or a good chunk of them, began to reach adulthood in the 60s and 70s. The baby boomers, challenged the interpersonal lifestyle of corporate America. I'll explain that in a moment. Questioned materialism of those in charge, whom they called the establishment. And so what we're looking at is the first generation, or at least a part of the first generation, to sort of reject the materialism, the capitalism of the people in charge. The people in charge they refer to as the establishment. And we're going to go into a little bit more of that in the next page or so. But we're looking at impersonal, I think I said interpersonal, sorry if I said that a few months ago, impersonal lifestyle of corporate America, because that makes a whole lot more sense, okay? Impersonal, yeah, it helps when you can read. Impersonal lifestyle of corporate America, in which, corporate America wanted people to buy goods that they were producing so that way they can make money. And of course corporate America was supported by the establishment, the federal government, which made laws that allowed corporate America to make money. And so the youth culture of the baby boom generation, some of the youngest of the baby boomers, were affected by rock music and followed the fashions and the behaviors of rock stars. And of course, we see this all the time. Whomever the latest rock star is comes out with some goofy looking haircut, or starts wearing their pants halfway down their knees, or whatever the case may be, and the culture of the youth of today follow that. Again, this is nothing new. This has been going on for a long, long time. And so the youth culture, some of the youngest of the baby boomers, were very affected by rock music, in particular groups like the Beatles, and many of the baby boomers, particularly the younger ones, followed their fashions, their behaviors. The Beatles, the Beatle haircut became quite popular. Well, let's talk about the Beatles first, and then get back to that. Rock band of England, whose hairstyles, music, and lifestyles were copied by the youth culture. Essentially, the Beatles wore the Beatle haircut, which was before that called a bowl haircut, as if you let your hair grow straight out, you put a bowl over your head and cut out everything that is showing. That's the Beatles hairstyle. Their music, which was highly influential. In fact, I doubt there is anyone today who's making music who wasn't at one time, one way or another, affected by the Beatles music. And we will see some examples of the Beatles in context of the Beatles music as we go. Let's go on to our next slide. Number 50, hippies. Now, this is still a smaller group of the baby boomers. Now, again, we have baby boomers, anyone born between 1945 and 1963. And there was a group of them who we refer to as hippies. It's a smaller group, a smaller subset of the baby boomers, left mainstream society altogether. They just sort of rejected. Ooh, that's a little bit too thick. Let me change that a little bit better. They left mainstream society altogether and went on to live more or less a self-sufficient life in a commune. A commune is essentially a small community in which everybody sort of shares the work and shares the bounty of the work, in kind of a socialistic environment. So they went to live on these self-sufficient communes, completely rejecting traditional values and morals. For example, marriage. Baby boomers, hippies within the baby boom generation basically said, well, I don't need a piece of paper to prove I love you. So traditional marriage was kicked out. They also, again, the hippies embraced alternative styles of dress with longer hair and beads, and of course drugs. There was a great deal of music in the late 60s that promoted drug usage. And so these hippies living in these communes would again live this communal lifestyle on a little bit of a farm. Everybody work in the farm and everybody enjoy the harvest, and again traditional values like marriage, traditional values like a regular job. You get up, you go to work, come home, take your kids to ball games, barbecue, that kind of stuff. That was rejected by them. And again, the morals was also an issue because, again, one of the key things that the hippies rejected was marriage, traditional religion within the Catholic Church, within the Baptist Church, or whatever denomination, doesn't matter. And so they came up with some alternative religious lifestyles. And we will see, if we haven't already, we will see some videos and some discussion on this as we go. So again, I don't want to go into too much depth because, again, this is an introduction to all the vocabulary terms, and we'll take a look at some of these different concepts in greater depth through other videos. Let's go on to number 51, the 26th Amendment in 1971. Due to the Vietnam War, the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18. In 1971, the legal drinking age was 18. In 1971, you could be drafted and serve in the military at the age of 18. What you could not do was vote. And so it was thought that that was wrong. If I, as an 18-year-old young man in 1971, could vote, if I could serve my country, fight and die in Vietnam, if I could buy a beer, but I couldn't vote, that was wrong. So we dropped the voting age from 21 to 18. Now, the drinking age remained 18 till sometime in I want to say 1983, 1984, somewhere around there. And the voting age has stayed at 18 since that time. The only way to change it would, of course, be to add an additional constitutional amendment. All right, let's move forward. Number 52, the Vietnam War, 1954 through 1973. This is a war in which we, the United States of America, the French a little bit, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, Russia, and China all participated to one extent or another. Okay, Essentially, the Vietnam War was a conflict between the communist-controlled North Vietnam and the democratic-controlled South. We, the United States, sided with the South Vietnamese. Of course, they're democratic, and of course, this goes to the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrines, which we discussed earlier. Communist nations like China and Russia aided the North Vietnamese. And we'll take a look at a little bit more depth and detail as we go on the next slide. But essentially, this was a civil war between the aggressor North Vietnamese, who had the backing of the Chinese and Russians, who were invading the South, who called out for help. We responded, again, based on the concepts of the domino theory and the Truman and Eisenhower doctrines. All right, let's go to number 53, Ho Chi Minh. As I'm waiting for my drawing mode to kick in, Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the North Vietnamese. He was a communist leader, there, right there. In 1954, the Vietnamese nationalists, led by Ho Chi Minh, defeated the French troops at a place called Dien Bien Phu. If you've ever seen the movie We Are Soldiers, Mel Gibson's look at the Vietnam War, and we'll probably watch a few moments from it before we finish this chapter. The opening scenes are of the French being defeated at Dien Bien Phu by the Ho Chi Minh-led North Vietnamese communists. Anyway, once the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, they withdrew from Vietnam. Now, a few decades before, during the colonial period of more than a few decades, in the late early 1900s, many European countries moved into Southeast Asia and started colonies. The French had a number of colonies in what is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And here's Cambodia and Laos right there. And in 1954, the French were essentially kicked out of Vietnam altogether, leaving the South Vietnamese essentially with no allies. And as it states right here, much of Indonesia had been colonized by the French decades earlier. At the Geneva Conference, I don't know if we discussed this Geneva Conference after World War II, had to do with the treatment of prisoners and a number of other issues. Also at this conference, the former colonies, the former French colonies of Laos and Cambodia, were made into separate independent states. So they became free independent nations. Vietnam, at the Geneva Conference, was divided into two states, with Ho Chi Minh and the communists in control of the north, and then a pro-Western government in the south. So once the French are out, the pro-Western democracy, South Vietnam, was on its own, again facing the threat of invasion from North Vietnamese and the communist countries of China and Russia. Now, at the Geneva Conference, there was supposed to be, in 1956, elections that would then determine, which would reunite the two, North and South, and determine what direction the country would go. The South Vietnamese president would not allow those elections, which caused further friction between the two of them, and a short time later, we see the North invading the South. We, the United States, replaced France as the principal supporter of South Vietnam. Okay. The Viet Cong, South Vietnamese communists. The Viet Cong, or oftentimes just called the Cong, they were South Vietnamese citizens who supported communism. The domino theory, number 55. According to this theory, if South Vietnam fell to communism, then neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos, neighboring countries would be more likely to fall to communism. The more countries that are under communist control, the more likely are to fall. Sorry. I missed the word right there. The more countries under communist control, the more likely more are to fall under communist control. So the domino theory is real simple. You stack Dominoes up, you hit the first one, the second one falls, the third one falls, the fourth one falls, same concept. Here in the domino theory, if the first country falls to communism, let's just say South Vietnam, the second one falls, the third one falls, the fourth one falls, and more likely to fall under communist control. And again, that goes directly against our philosophy of containment, which we talked about in the previous chapter. So, Ho Chi Minh, leader of the North Vietnamese Communists, Viet Cong, South Vietnamese who favored communism, and the domino theory is what we were trying to stop by going to the aid of South Vietnam. All right, as we're waiting for the drawing mode, it is very slow. We're looking at number 56, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, 1964. Keep in mind, the French were kicked out in 1954. We sort of became the protector, if you will, of South Vietnam under Eisenhower, and then a little bit under Kennedy. We sent some money, some advisors, both military and CIA advisors, to South Vietnam to help them raise a military, to train a military to protect themselves against the North Vietnamese. In 1964, a North Vietnamese warship attacked an American warship in international waters, which is in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water right off the coast of North Vietnam. Congress gave LBJ full military powers to stop North Vietnam's aggression. So what we have here, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the North Vietnamese attacked an American warship in what was supposed to be international waters. Congress gave LBJ full military powers to stop the aggression of North Vietnam. Now again, it's not quite that simple. Whether or not the North Vietnamese fired first, or we did, whether or not we were in international waters or North Vietnamese waters, is kind of some questions that have never been fully answered. There are many who believe that LBJ was pushing North Vietnam to do something dumb, like what they did there, so that way he could take troops into Vietnam to repel, to force the North Vietnamese to retreat. Now, whether it was a predetermined goal or whether it was just something that sort of fell in his lap, LBJ got what he wanted when this occurred, because again, Congress gave him all he needed to stop North Vietnam. Number 57, napalm. Jellied gasoline. I'm sure you're familiar with this. We first used this in World War II. We will see some images, some video of the use of napalm sometime before we finish this chapter. It was used quite effectively to attack enemy positions. Agent Orange, a herbicide used to destroy the jungle cover that was used by the Viet Cong. Again, Vietnam is a jungle environment. Much of the country is covered by jungle. What's not covered by jungle is essentially rice paddies and other areas used for farming. But in some places, the jungle of Vietnam is so thick, it's essentially a triple canopy. What that means is you have one set of trees so close together, they're growing together, where the branches are intermingled. Then a second set of trees above that, and then a third set of trees above that. In many places, you would drop a 500-pound bomb, and the trees were the tree limbs were so grown together that the bomb would not make its way to the ground. The tree branches would hold up a 500-pound bomb so it wouldn't reach the ground and explode. And if you're underneath that, then essentially you could be protected. So Agent Orange was used as a way to destroy the jungle cover used by the Viet Cong, therefore allowing us more easy access to attack the bad guys on the ground. It later led to many health issues among American soldiers, like cancer. Many soldiers who survived the war in Vietnam came home with cancer and died of that. Saigon, capital city of South Vietnam. Roy Benavides, American soldier facing constant enemy fire, and despite being critically injured, he was able to save 8 men by getting them to rescue helicopters. kind of like we've seen Forrest Gump, okay? But this is actual a real guy, and for this, Mr. Benavides was, because he's able to rescue all these people, 8 men, and get them to rescue helicopters, he was given pretty much every medal there is to receive from the United States government, including the Congressional Medal of Honor. Just one of a number who did this. The media, look at newspapers, television, magazines, and everyone else who's involved with the media, radios, no internet at this time, but later. The media had a great influence upon the American people during the war. The Vietnam War is the first televised war in U.S. history. What we're looking at is the media and men like Walter Cronkite, who was the anchor of CBS News. They had tremendous influence on American opinion. Now again, when it states here the first televised war, what they're talking about is that, prior to Vietnam War, we had seen images, we had seen video of combat, but never hours after it occurred. It could be weeks, months, years. So every night in the 1960s, like today, many people come home. People come home from work, they make dinner, and the family sits together to watch TV while they eat dinner. And oftentimes, of course, we eat dinner when the news is on. And of course, in the 1960s, 1970s, we didn't have cable news, didn't have direct TV, didn't have internet, and didn't have those things. And so you would have 3, 4, 5 channels, and at 6 o'clock, 6:30 or so, there would be the news. The national news at 6 and the local news at 6:30. So you sit down and eat, and there's the news. And you could see every day while you're eating dinner video that had been captured that day. As a young boy, I remember watching the news, and they would have a total of dead and wounded. The weekly total of American dead and wounded, the monthly total of American dead and wounded, the yearly total, and then the projected dead and total of the enemy. And so every night there would be a running total. 5 Americans were killed, 3 are missing in action this week in South Vietnam or North Vietnam, wherever it was. And so it was this media coverage. That is why we refer to it as the first televised war in American history. We're going to do one more, and we're going to finish it up. Number 62, the credibility gap. Lyndon Johnson wasn't the first president who wasn't believed, but he was really the first one where his statements were directly, refuted on TV. Okay, let's do this. Credibility gap. LBJ reported that America was winning the war, but the media was reporting something different. So LBJ, credibility gap, LBJ reported that America was winning, but what we saw on our TV was vastly different. This created what is known as a credibility gap. Okay? We, the population, heard on TV, we heard and saw certain things, but we were told something different from Washington. So what we're being told by our president, by the administration, was one thing, everyone in the war, but then we see on TV with our own eyes something that is directly different, completely refuting what the president is saying. And so that credibility gap meant more and more people were beginning to doubt the president. And when he came out and spoke, people, how do we know that's true? Richard Nixon, 1968, the Republican candidate won the presidential election. He made a name for himself in the early 50s as an anti-communist, and he promised to bring the war to an end with peace and honor. Many people saw the handling of LBJ's handling of the war as being trying not to lose, as opposed to trying to win. And so in 1968, even though LBJ was eligible to run for another term, he chose not to, partially because of the fact that the war was going not really well, and to be perfectly honest, he wasn't very popular. When the primary season started, he lost the first primary two pretty badly, and he decided, you know what, I'm not going to put up with this. He never really sought it. Remember, keep in mind, he became president when Kennedy was killed. And so he was being yelled at and screamed at by hippies, on the media were ripping him, on and on and on. So again, he said, you know what, I'm not going to run. I'm going to focus the last year or so I have of my presidency to winning the war. Well, he doesn't. Nixon comes in, and it's Nixon who promises to win with peace and honor. Henry Kissinger was the lead diplomat for Nixon during the Vietnam peace talks. Kissinger, brilliant man, was the Secretary of State, and he would be going back and forth between the United States and Paris, where the peace talks were being held between us and the North Vietnamese, and he's the one who eventually brokers a deal to end the war. Vietnamization, Vietnamization, there we go, consisted of turning over the war to the South Vietnamese. We are training South Vietnamese troops to become more self-efficient, training them to become soldiers. In addition to our training of and increasing the South Vietnamese readiness, we increased bombing in the North to force the North to the peace talks. And finally, we increased aid to South Vietnam. So, Vietnamization, we turned the war over to the South Vietnamese. We increased bombing in the North to make the North come to the peace talks, to bring them to the tables, so we can seek an end to the war. And we increased our aid, monetary and military aid, to the South. Now, all of this, the credibility gap, Nixon being elected, the Vietnamization of the war, led to a large number of anti-war protests, and some of them became quite violent. We're going to look at some of them. You had groups like SNCC and the Black Panthers, who are two radical, anti-establishment, anti-white, violent groups who are protesting the war. Okay, let's get to those in a little bit more depth in a moment. Started on the youth of college youth protesting the war because, let's face it, it was that age group who could be drafted and be sent to the war. Pretty soon, the anti-war protests spread from college campuses to essentially mainstream America. More and more people became opposed to the war, and these protests on college campuses and elsewhere became more and more violent. More often than not, these college campuses resorted to violence due to the extremists on college campuses like the Black Panthers and SNCC. So the anti-war protests were essentially, at first, anti-war college campus protests, people on colleges saying, no to the war, picketing, conducting sit-ins and other relatively peaceful demonstrations against the war. But when you throw in violent groups like SNCC and the Black Panthers, more and more violence ensues, and therefore more and more public attention is drawn to it. As more and more public attention is drawn to the anti-war protests becoming more and more violent, at Kent State in Ohio, 4 college kids were shot and killed by the National Guard that were called out by the Ohio governor to put down the anti-war protests. And that's just one example of a number of college protests that became violent. Okay, we're going to stop it here. This has been part 4 of our look at the material.